This little handbag's made from cotton. It's fully lined and it's got this rather sweet little heart-shaped pocket on the front of it. You can make it in any size that you like, but it's really easy to make, but I think quite pretty and quite practical as well. So let's get measuring. Is that right? I've got 2 pieces of the outer fabric and then 2 pieces of lining fabric. My outer fabric, the bit you can see, measures in inches about 13 by 13. It's actually 13.5 by 13. It's slightly longer. That doesn't have to be set in stone. You can have that whatever size you like. But with the lining fabric, I've measured my 13 inches across, but this time the length is that little bit longer. This is 14.5 inches, so it's half an inch longer. And I'll show you why later on. For the straps, I've cut out the same colour of the lining fabric in quite a wide strip, so I'll just measure that for you as measuring about 4 inches by 20. I've folded in half, then folded in half again, and now I'm just going to top stitch down the edge. You could make a tube and turn it inside out, but I find that quite time consuming. I find this is an awful lot quicker, and you will see the top stitching, but if you use the same colour thread, then that doesn't matter. So I'll sew that together in a second, and then just to decorate it, I'm putting a piece of ribbon over the top of the outer edge and just top stitch that in place, and then I'll press that so that this is the kind of result that I get. That's my straps. I'll put those to one side for a second. I'm also making a pocket for the front of the bag, and I've made a heart design, and I've cut out 2 pieces of fabric again, one in the outer fabric, but this time it's in the opposite direction, so my stripes are going down, so my pocket's going to stand out, and I've lined the pocket in the same colour as the lining fabric. So I'll sew that together now, and the way I'll do that is to put my fabrics face together like so. I'm going to start sewing just to one side, and I'll need to leave a gap of around about 2 inches so that I can turn that inside out. So I'll just pin those in place to hold it there, and then just do a long straight stitch all the way around the edge. So again, leaving that gap, about 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tack to hold it in place, and then I'll start sewing all the way around the edge. So snip away the excess thread when it comes off the machine. And then take your pins out before you turn it, obviously. And just before I do turn it, I'm taking some very sharp little scissors, and I'm going to cut into the point here, and then just gently snip into the seam, not through the stitches, but just randomly around the edge, and that helps to stop the fabric from puckering when you turn it inside out. Across the point of the heart, I'm going to cut the excess fabric here, so that when I do turn it inside out, it keeps that point nice and sharp. And again, just really quickly, just freeing up, because you imagine when this is turned inside out, all of the excess fabric is going to be all bunching up on the inside. So I want to keep that as smooth as I can. But that excess little bit of fabric there, I'm just going to trim that away. Like that. Turn it inside out. I'm not worried about sewing across the hole that I've left, because my top stitching will cover that over. So push out the shape of the heart, keeping that nice and flat, and the other side. And at this point I would normally get the iron back on and give it a press, but I'm not going to today. I'll just press. It's cotton, it presses quite easily. So there's my, oh out you can, my heart design. Now I want to make it look as though it's top stitched all the way around the pocket, but I don't want to go over the stitches twice, because the bottom section is going to be sewn onto the bag as the pocket. With the open little bit, I'm just going to tuck that in and press it, and you will never know that that wasn't sewn. And in fact I can just put a pin in there to keep it in place. so that saves a little bit of time. So press it if you want to, but I'm just going to top stitch, and I'm going to sew the top section here now, and then the bottom section will be top stitched when it's applied to the bag. So I'm going to mark where the top of my pocket's going to be, which will be around about there, because if it's too low down then this section is going to flap over. If I fold that in half and line them up, then I know that on the other half my stitching is going to be perfectly symmetrical. And you could use your decorative stitches here if you like. I'm going to use a stretch fabric stitch, I should say, because it gives a denser look to the fabric. And I'm just going to sew around about 1/4 of an 1/8 of an inch all the way around the edge. And it's a really nice dense decorative stitch, and it makes the outline stand out. It's a nice stitch to use on jeans as well actually, but that's a whole other video. So stop at the point, needle in the down position so that you can pivot, and that keeps the outline nice and sharp, and then carry on around the other half. And remember, I'm going to stop when I reach that pin. And then cut away my excess thread. I can take the pins out at this point because they were there just to mark where I stop and where I start, and I'm going to trim that thread right back to the fabric so I don't see any of that at all on both sides. Now the next thing I need to do is to apply the pocket to the bag. So I'll just move that out of the way and take the front of the bag. Now this is before I put the whole thing together, because I don't want to see my stitches from applying the pocket on the inside. Oops, to hold that. So this is going to go slightly above the centre line, because I'm going to make a base for the bag, so in effect that'll be the base by around about 2 inches, but I'll show you that in just a second. Now you can measure and mark that if you like, just to make sure that it's perfectly central, but there again, you could have it at a jaunty angle. I'm going to keep mine central though. And I think that's pretty accurate, I don't need to measure that. And I'm just going to pin that in place before I stitch. And my stitching this time is going to be from where I left here all the way around the bottom. So it looks like one outline all the way around, but actually half of it will be secured to the bag. So just line my foot up from where I left off, and then carry on all the way around. Now you could use a zigzag, a satin stitch, a decorative stitch, an embroidery stitch, a straight stitch. It really doesn't matter. This is the opening of the heart that I'm just sewing over now. I'm just taking my pins out as I go so I don't need those. Stop when you get to the point, needle down, and then pivot so you get that nice sharp point, and then carry on through to the other side to meet up with the first set of stitches that you made. So it's like a back stitch, backwards and forwards all the time. And then when you come back to the start, just stop. And with that particular stitch, there's no need to back tack it. So simply take that off, snip loose my threads, take my pins out, whoops, oh, there you go, and then I'm ready to piece the bag together. So I've pressed it and there's my pocket all in place. The next thing to do is to put the handles on. So I need to measure the centre point of my bag by folding it in half, and I'll just pop a pin in that centre section where I've just pressed it to crease it, just to mark the centre. And my handles need to go evenly either side, pointing downwards. So I'm going to line mine up with the edge of the heart. I'll pop a pin in there. And it doesn't matter how far across the handles come, as long as they're both equidistant from the central pin. And make sure that if the outside of your handle with the ribbon on is facing down on this side, it needs to face down on that side, because if it's on the other way around, then it's going to be twisted when you wear it. So I'll just give that a quick measure and make sure I'm about the same distance from either side of the pin, which I am, and pin that in place. On the reverse side of my bag, I'm going to do exactly the same, and I can measure from this side, oops, where the pins are going to go. So right side facing outwards, handles face down, bend that round so it meets up on the opposite side, and then my handles are symmetrical. Now the lining goes on next, and I'm just going to sew the top of the lining to the top of the bag, like so. And that'll go straight across where the handles have been attached. I'll just pin that there, and I'm just going to use just a straight stitch on the sewing machine. Over the handle, over the handle, and to the end. And then do the same on the back section of the bag. So again, I shan't pin this one, and just for speed's sake. So top section, do top section, stitch across the top, and then I'm going to open them up and press. Opened up and pressed, and I'm left with two pieces that look like this. So this is the back of the bag, there's my handle, there's my lining, and that's the front of the bag with a heart pocket on it. So now I need to put the front and the back together. So face sides together. I'm actually going to start sewing from this seam here, because you'll see that on the outside of the bag, and I want it lined up perfectly. So I'll just make sure that my stitches are in line. And I'm going to pop a pin on there just to secure. And then I'll sew all the way around the square and back up to the second side, where I'm going to put another pin in, because I want that to match up perfectly. So I'm going to start at the side, sew all the way down the bottom of the front of the bag, across the bottom, up the other side, and then around the lining. I'm going to leave a gap in the bottom of the lining by around about 4 inches, because that's where I'm going to turn it inside out, and then I'll carry on and back up to the start, and my seam should meet perfectly. So I've sewn all the way around the sides, gap at the top. Now before I turn inside out, I want to make a base for the bottom of the bag. So on the outer layer, I'm going to pull away the two corners like so. So that's the bottom of the bag, and I can feel when those seams are lined up. So I've got the seam on the side of the bag and the seam of the bottom of the bag perfectly lined up, and I'm going to put a pin in there. Then I'm going to measure, that's a big ruler to measure with, just 2 inches from the corner, not from the top of the fabric, from where the corner of the seam is, and that is where I'm going to sew across. So again, I'm going to put a pin in there to mark it, and I'm going to stitch across that corner. I'll just do that quickly. Repeat this on the other corners, but basically that's what I've ended up with, and then I'm going to cut across the corner here, leaving about 1/4 inch, and that's the base of my bag. So I'll need to do the same on the other side of the bag. Remember, I pulled this open, I felt where the seams were together and just secured that with a pin. Then I measured down 2 inches, don't argue. I said don't argue. I said, which is there. Put my pin across the mark and sew across the bottom, then cut off. And I'm going to do that on the lining sides as well. I am. When all my corners are cut off, then it's time to turn inside out. Now just before I put the lining inside the bag, I need to sew over the hole that I made for turning. Push out the corners in the bag, in the lining, and there's my gap for turning. Now what I'm going to do is fold in the edges and just top stitch on my sewing machine just across the top. I'll cut off the loose thread so it's nice and neat on the inside. If you wanted that really neat, then you could use a ladder stitch and hand sew it. But I don't really see the point, because it's on the inside of your bag and nobody's going to see it. So I'm just going to hold that nice and taut and do a quite close to the edge, just a ladder stitch very close to the edge. And then I'll push that inside out. Like so. Now right at the beginning I mentioned that I'd cut the lining fabric a couple of inches longer, or it was an inch to be exact, than the bag fabric, and there was a reason for that. When I push the lining inside there and line it up, the actual lining is ½ an inch longer. And that means that all the way around the top of the bag I've got a really nice kind of a border from the lining, and I just think it gives it an outline, it gives it a finishing touch. But the way that the straps have been attached means that they go into the seam. So all I need to do now is press that, make sure my lining's nice and square inside. I'll press the lining as it's exposed across the top of the bag there, and then it's finished.